and you're going to write a response to the way in which this chapter presents the plane crash and how it makes it a very dramatic moment for the reader and conveys the horror and the terrible experience for Brian. So there's a lot that you can refer to in this. Let me just give you a quick example. You're going to be mainly focusing on the number of techniques, the range of techniques used by the writer. And there's about, overall 8 to 10 of them that you could refer to. But before we go any further, I want to explain to you that when you do your homework, you need to organize it in a certain way, structure it in a certain way. And that way is not around the techniques. It's around the ideas and images and impressions we get of this action sequence. And I'll explain that in a minute. So let's begin now by closely examining chapter 3 and looking at the ways in which this chapter presents us with a dramatic action sequence, how the language and overall structure and style of this piece makes this a vivid episode for the reader. Let's have a look then. Are we ready? Going to die, Brian thought. Going to die, gonna die, gonna die. His whole brain screamed it in the sudden silence. Well, already we're looking at techniques at work, aren't we? Brian hasn't yet crashed, certainly, but he's about to. And we can see that there's the sibilant alliteration of sudden silence at the end of that, which is assisted by the verb screamed, of course. There's the repetition of die, 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 etc., being so strongly emphasized in the opening. This emphasizes, of course, Brian's sense of terror. His whole brain screamed, of course. Well, that's not possible. The brain isn't screaming. He's screaming as a person, isn't he? So we can take this really either as a synecdoche or as a personification, or really both, if you wish. And then the short fragment, the new line there, line 4, gonna die. So we've got repetition, we've got sibilant alliteration, we've got this use of a synecdoche or personification, and emphasizing at this point then Brian's sense of sheer terror at the imminent moment of dramatic impact, which he associates, as most of us would, with death. Because for Brian, this isn't just about something terrifying, it's something worse. It's really life and death. He wiped his mouth with the back of his arm and held the nose down. The plane went into a glide, a very fast glide at 8 altitude. And suddenly there weren't any lakes. Of course, Brian, as we know, has been looking for the lakes because he's shown this skill to us before, this attribute, this survival quality. He knows that in crashing into the trees, it's likely that the plane will be torn to pieces, and the altitude of the trees, etc., would make it more likely that he won't survive. He's looking for a lake, and he's even more alert and astute. He's looking for the edge of the lake, as you remember. When he says the plane 8 altitude, in this case, of course, it's eating away at the height that the plane is traveling because it's descending rapidly. It's run out of petrol. And so it's also, by the way, a good example of a form of alliteration we call vocalic alliteration. The A sounds are being repeated, 8 altitude, but in different forms, A and A. And so, yes, it's a variation on the theme of alliteration. It's vocalic alliteration. And Brian now is confronted with the horrifying realization that he hasn't been able to make it to a lake, apparently. All he'd seen since they started flying over the forest was lakes, and now they were gone, gone. Again, we end a sentence with one word and begin another sentence with the same word. Well, it is a form of repetition, yes. It even has its own name. It's anadiplosis, which is where you commence a successive phrase or sentence with the word that ended the previous one. So you end one phrase or sentence with a word and you commence the next phrase or sentence with the same word. It's anadiplosis. Out in front, far away at the horizon, he could see lots of them, glittering blue in the late afternoon sun. A rather beautiful description, glittering blue in the late afternoon sun. Almost, we could say, poetic description, which emphasizes how, for Brian, this is a tormenting sight of something so desired. The beauty of this spectacle of the lake, which for him represents a greater chance of survival, and yet it's out of reach. It's that tormenting impossibility of reaching it as far as he can see. And by the way, we have in the repetition this anadiplosis of of gone, and it's actually repeated elsewhere in this extract, by the way, you'll see that soon. The emphasis here is upon something that is no longer available to him, unattainable, and therefore the feeling, this sense of absence, the feeling of, for him, of obviously grave disappointment, of loss, of absence. But he needed one right in front. He desperately needed, again, repetition of key words, needed, desperately needed. And by the way, the adverb desperately intensifies the verb here, the need for this, that Brian himself is so desperately longing for it. A lake right in front of the plane, more of that repetition, and all he saw through the windshield were trees, green death trees. We see this constantly with Paulsen, his use of repetition, and a repetition that, by the way, involves what we really could call a form of intensification or amplification. To intensify, to amplify means to sort of enhance or increase or to make greater. And in this case, trees is replaced by green death trees. We have two adjectives now attached to the word, to the noun, and it makes them, of course, even more dangerous. The imminent sense of impact on these trees, the life-threatening danger is created by those two adjectives, green death trees. And by the way, we did notice once before the assonance of sounds, or the repeated internal vowel sounds, green and trees, you understand? So we've got not only the effect of the adjectives, particularly the word death, which is, of course, used here as a noun, but it actually describes the trees, doesn't it? If he had to turn, he didn't think he could keep the plane flying. His stomach tightened into a series of rolling knots, and his breath came in short bursts. Ellipsis used, isn't it, to end this sentence, incomplete sentence, on a note of suspense, and to emphasize the physical reaction in Brian now. He's physically reacting to the horror with the stomach tightening in knots. There's rolling knots, the short bursts of breath. There, of course, a single line, isolated, a fragment. It obviously creates a sudden sense of hope. Not quite in front, but slightly to the right, he saw a lake, L-shaped, with rounded corners. And the plane was nearly aimed at the long part of the L, coming from the bottom and heading to the top, just a tiny bit to the right. He pushed the right rudder pedal gently and the nose moved over. You can see how from the previous single word fragment there, we've got longer sentences now occurring, particularly the second one of that paragraph. This tends to do the following. It relaxes the pace a little because there's hope now. The feeling that there's a chance he can actually achieve his plan, which is to land on a lake, and especially towards the edge of the lake. And in this case, it seems a little more likely too, because his plane is aimed at the longer part of the L, giving him more of a chance of landing safely, more room. But the turn cost him speed, and now the lake was above the nose. He pulled back on the wheel slightly and the nose came up. This caused the plane to slow dramatically and almost seemed to stop and wallow in the air. The controls became very loose feeling and frightened Brian, making him push the wheel back in. This increased the speed a bit, but filled the windshield once more with nothing but trees and put the lake well above the nose and out of reach. So once again, we're getting almost a kind of physical roller coaster of the nose going up and down, but also an emotional roller coaster reflecting what Brian is feeling. Moment of hope, followed by moments of almost despair and disappointment and fear again. We're seeing a word come into play here, a negative word like nothing but trees. And there are other negatives as well later on. This is, of course, a succession of words that have negative associations, which adds to the overall fabric of feeling here, that things are not going according to plan. There's a negative element in the description. Things are going wrong, not right. I hope everyone's being attentive with their pens here, writing notes. For a space of 3 or 4 seconds, things seem to hang almost to stop. Now, this is a very familiar aspect of moments that people have experienced involving life and death situations, very perilous situations where time seems to slow down. It therefore means that the writer is imbuing this description here with a sense of verisimilitude, of realism, because it is a widely experienced phenomenon, this, where when people are faced with terrifying danger, it's as if time shifts, it changes, it slows down. The action seems to slow down because the senses are now raised to a level of almost hyper-realism, of hyper-intensity. And this seems to have an effect upon our registering of time. Things that take only a few seconds seem to be protracted, drawn out. So again, this is part of verisimilitude, the manipulation of time. Now, of course, in films, this is demonstrated through a particular film technique. When there is a moment of great danger, intense action, then the director tends to use the technique of slow motion. So if there is a car that is suddenly caught up in a terrifying accident and it spins out of control, and then perhaps it hits a bump and leaps into the air and turns over, all of that can often be conveyed through slow motion. Do you understand? Helping to intensify what is a very lived experience for people who've had this kind of terrifying moment in life. The plane was flying, but so slowly, so slowly. Again, this alliteration and repetition here. And of course, the repetition is the key idea to it, is the adverbs that help to emphasize the unreal sense of time slowing down. The plane is not flying slowly, of course. It's actually moving quite quickly across the sky naturally, but for Brian, the terrifying life and death immediacy of the situation brings out this an unnatural sense of time dilation. There's the phrase you can use. It would never reach the lake. There's another one of those negatives here, of course, emphasizing the unreality for Brian. Dream-like unreality, never reach the lake. Brian looked out to the side and saw a small pond. And at the edge of the pond, some large animal, he thought, a moose, standing out in the water. Again, I love this detail, you know, because the first thing is that he's in a moment of sheer horror and terror. And yet, in that moment, he's able to register these fine details. He's up there in the plane, and yet he can see, oh, isn't that a moose there? You know, he can see everything with an intense clarity. You know the word clarity, it means very clear detail. This intense clarity, which tells us about how his senses have been elevated to this incredible sharpness and alertness, which is when we are confronting life and death situations. You know, the senses are suddenly injected with this incredible vividness and vitality and energy. And he's able to even recognize the detail of the moose, even as his plane is about to crash. And by the way, it's a very clever detail too, by the way, because it actually foreshadows the appearance of this animal later on in the story. And so still looking, so stopped. You can see again, there's this repetition, isn't it? This Anaphora, so still looking, so stopped. And once more, it's the alliteration of these sounds that aren't supposed to be harsh and sibilant. I think it's more to do with the softness of it all, because it's all taking on this dreamy quality. And so the sounds wouldn't want to be registering here in a very unpleasant way. They'd be registering in this soft, dreamy state. And so still looking, so stopped. And by the way, isn't so with its O sound an open vowel sound? So, you know, this is sort of rolling, open, almost hypnotic sound. The pond and the moose and the trees, you notice the polysyndeton, don't you? The detail of these three things within his field of vision, everything taking on this supercharged, crystal clear detail. reflecting the intensity of his emotions and his senses raised to that level of extreme alertness. As he slid over them, more of these softer sounds, isn't it? And also, it's something of a metaphor. He's not really sliding over anything. And now only 300 or 400 feet off the ground, all like a picture. And similarly closing this whole scene that I've mentioned a moment ago, the scene of almost, shall we say, time suspension, as if everything is frozen in place and it's not real. It's like a picture. So again, all of the techniques I've just reflected upon in that paragraph that capture for this moment of time dilation, the protracted nature of time, as if life itself for a moment is suspended. It's very much a realistic detail. That's the thing that you need to emphasize here, this sense of verisimilitude, because this is a well-documented experience for people who've had such horrifying moments in life and death situation. It's well documented that time does seem to indeed slow down. And now we find the shift from this moment almost of suspended time into sudden and dramatic succession of actions. It begins with a shorter sentence, then everything happened at once. A sort of blunt return to the immediate moment of the crash. And then, as I said a moment ago, to a chain of actions that capture for us this shocking moment of crash landing on the lake. Trees suddenly took on detail, filled his whole field of vision with green, and he knew he would hit and would die. But his luck held, and just as he was about to hit, he came into an open lane, a channel of fallen trees, a wide place leading to the lake. A few things to note, of course. Hit and would die. This is using the repetition of the word at the end of successive phrases of clauses. What's that called again, by the way? Yes, Lucy?
Epistrophe?
Yes, it's called epistrophe or epiphora. Yes, you're repeating at the end of successive phrases or clauses, or as opposed to at the beginning, which, as you know, is anaphora, which we've already noted today's lesson as well. I'm sure you did notice too in this paragraph, we have only two sentences, the short, blunt opening one, which prepares us for the crash, and then a longer one. And in this case, again, I think it helps to emphasize the series of things that are happening around Brian and emotions that he's experienced, all working together at this critical moment right up to the hitting of the top of the trees and followed that by the hitting of the lake too. The plane, committed now to landing, to crashing, fell into the wide place like a stone. You see the simile obviously there, emphasizing the plunging, plummeting experience. And Brian eased back on the wheel and braced himself for the crash. Even here, by the way, Brian shows that sense of self-control. Did you notice? He's easing back on the wheel. If you're only literally split seconds away from hitting and yet you're able to exercise control over your body, I think that's a no mean feat. The sense of self-control that Brian has, we've already seen exercised in this perilous situation. But there was a tiny bit of speed left, and when he pulled on the wheel, the nose came up and he saw in front the blue of the lake. And at that instant, the plane hit the trees. Another one of those longer sentences again, and making use too of polysyndeton, as I'm sure you noticed. It's really as if this moment, which is literally the moment just before the crash itself, the sentences are longer, drawing that moment out, not only helping to prolong the sense of tension for the reader, but also emphasizing for us what we've said before about Brian experiencing this feeling here of time dilation, and now the actual crash itself. So we shift into the crash. There was a great wrenching as the wings caught the pines at the side of the clearing and broke back, ripping back just outside the main braces. Well, look at that sentence. Is wrenching and wings an example of alliteration, Oliver? Wrenching and wings, both words start with the same consonant. Is that alliteration, though? Oliver? No, it isn't, you're right, but can you tell me why it isn't? It is not alliteration. Who can tell me why it isn't alliteration? All right, Jackie, tell me.
They don't start with the same letters.
Well, they do. Wrenching starts with a W and wing starts with a W. How about you, Annie?
They both start with a W, but they don't make the same sound.
That is correct. They have to make the same consonant sounds, don't they? That's the thing about alliteration. It doesn't necessarily mean that the succession of words commences with the same consonant, but it must be to make alliteration the same consonant sound. So wrenching and wings isn't alliteration. But let's have a look at that sentence in terms of its diction, the choice of words. Look at words like wrenching, then caught, then broke, and ripping. These words are all to do with violent action, aren't they? Particularly, of course, verbs. And this is necessary in creating a vivid action description sequence, as you would have to if you were writing yourself an action sequence. Imagine somebody who's skiing down a slope, for example, they lose balance and then they tumble. And then there's this dreadful moment where they're tossing end over end, sideways and backwards and upside down, and things are getting snagged and caught and they're bumps and so on. You want all of those verbs peppering that description to give it a vivid feeling of the chaotic action. And that's what's happening here. So we've got all these verbs at work, and they're not finished with. There's going to be plenty of them. So one of the things that we will be referring to is the particular choice of word, the writer's diction, and especially the lexical chains, the semantic fields, where we've got a whole series of words functioning to create a total effect of chaotic and violent destructive action. So you want to make use of those phrases too in your homework, the lexical chains or semantic fields. Let's move on then, please. Broke back, by the way, is very hard. Plosive alliterated B sounds. I'm sure you're picking that up. There is alliteration in the sentence, not the wrenching and wings, but the broke and the back. And remember, these are hard, plosive B sounds. They are necessary to give a sense of extra force and energy through sound to the violent action that we're looking at, things being ripped apart. Dust and dirt, more alliteration. Again, these harder D sounds coming into play, just like the harder B sounds. Dust and dirt blew off the floor into his face so hard he thought there must have been some kind of explosion. He was momentarily blinded and slammed forward in the seat, smashing his head on the wheel. Again, if you looked at the whole of this paragraph, just cast your eye over all of the words that convey violent action. Let's list them: wrenching, caught, broke, ripping, blew, blinded, slammed, smashing. Lots of them, isn't it? So again, this is very much to do with the idea of a semantic field of words that convey a particular single impression, in this case, of the terrifying destructive violence of the crash itself as the plane is being torn apart. You can even notice, by the way, in the last sentence, I'm sure you picked it up, another technique that helps to add to this overall impression, this time a sound technique. We've already referred to it once before. Can you pick it up, anyone? Yes, Jaden?
Alliteration.
Yes, and what other word would we want to combine with the note that this is an alliteration that helps define that alliteration? What's the word you want for this kind of alliteration, Mandy? In that last sentence, blinded and slammed forward in the seat, smashing, he said. What's the word we want, Mandy?
Sibilant.
Yeah, the word sibilant. So you'd necessarily want to include that in your homework too. Not just mention that it's alliteration, everyone, but define the kind of alliteration. In this case, the sound it produces, which is not supposed to be gentle or soft. It's supposed to be harsh to emphasize the action itself. And you make sure that you connect that point, don't you? You don't just simply say it's a harsh sound. You say this matches the action itself. The action we won't describe as simply being harsh, but as violent. So harshness is a forceful and unpleasant sound, just as the action itself is violent and forceful. So that's what you do. You try to find words that connect together, like this forceful sound matches the forceful action. You can repeat the word to create the connection between the technique and its effect, linking back to the particular situation. and thus eventually, of course, when you see it, to the question, the demands of the question. The long sentence, by the way, is again a technique that's useful here to help in the description of this moment. Why? What does it achieve by being a long sentence, anyone? Well, first of all, it emphasizes how prolonged for Brian this agonizing moment is. It's not like hit and it's over, everything's finished with. It's, for Brian, a moment that seems to take forever. It seems to be taking so long for the plane to finally come to rest on the water, doesn't it? Again, it's really getting back to this whole idea of the heightened awareness, the heightened and intensified state of his emotions and feelings, of his physical senses that respond to this life-threatening situation. It's as if he's saying, please, let it be over. But the sentence continues, it goes on, just as it feels the same for Brian. The terrible moment seems to be so prolonged, just like the long sentence. That's where you can create a match, you know, between the technique, long sentence, and your understanding of its effect, which is for Brian, the sense that it is a prolonged moment of terror and of danger. He wants it desperately to end. Okay, so we've got two techniques so far, simile and the long sentence. We can talk about both in our analysis for homework. So, Lucy, you wanted to add one.
Asyndeton.
So you're talking about Asyndeton. And as we know, it's the omission of conjunctions between phrases and clauses. And as you can see, quite often, it's replaced by commas. The absence of the conjunctions doesn't have to be, but it is here. So it's Asyndeton, and both Asyndeton and polysyndeton really can achieve the same kind of effect. They can vary, and they do. The idea of something being listed is one of the effects here. The idea of a sequence or series of actions or of things being described, generally speaking. It could be an array of things. That's not actions, that's just a lot of things, and you can use Asyndeton or polysyndeton for it. In this case, the Asyndeton, it actually works slightly different from how perhaps polysyndeton would work, because it creates a choppy, fragmented effect. Blew out through the trees, out over the water and down to slam and then skip. These phrases are chopped up by the use of the Asyndeton, and that in turn creates this disjointed, fragmented effect, capturing for us the violent series of actions that Brian is feeling. 3 techniques so far. Is there anything more? Anyone? All right, Jaden.
Alliteration.
Tell me where.
Windows, water.
Yes, and you know, it's certainly something that is a repetition of the sound, and I think it will work here. Sometimes it's more coincidental, shattered the side windows, water that drove him back. I would prefer to look for an example of alliteration that's perhaps a little bit more forceful, because that's almost rather, shall we say, accidental or coincidental. What about shattered side? Now that's a harsher sibilant sound, isn't it? That would work. I think that you look for the ones that create a stronger sound to match the situation, the violence of situation. Anything else? Anyone? Jaden again.
Alliteration at roll to the right.
Yes, roll to the right, capturing for us the sense of the disorienting sound, experience of movement. Yes. Anything else, anyone? Because there's more. And by the way, for homework, you'll have to be selective, choosing the ones that are the best choice for each technique. And you might have to use, and you will, I'm sure, use several examples of a similar technique for different aspects of this experience. Again, Jaden?
Polysyndeton.
So you're talking about the repetition of the conjunction here. Yes, it's not really as obvious as the use of Asyndeton, but it's there. I mean, the conjunction and is repeated, what, at least 3 times. So you can add that to your analysis as well. This helps again to convey a sequence of actions, a series of things happening. Another thing that you should be noting, of course, is once more going back to the diction. Let's have a look at the words that are particularly dramatic here. We've got crashing, we've got ripping, we've got blew, and then we've got tore and shattered and drove. Once again, we're looking at a semantic field, a series of words all contributing to a single effect, and that is the horrifying, chaotic, violent action of the actual plane crash moment. So make sure you bring that into play as well. Okay, we could actually find more, but let's move on because we've got quite a lot of things to talk about so far and to add to them. Now, somebody was screaming, more sibilant alliteration and repetitions. Somebody was screaming as the plane drove down into the water. He's using a lot of this repetition. It's even in the next sentence. Someone screamed, type animal screams. Now, let's just stop for a second. We've got drove down in the previous sentence, in part of this paragraph, if you noticed. Down, down, drove down. Once more, those harder D sounds, the repetition of that word itself, emphasizing the violent force that is pushing him into the water. Now we've got the repetition of screamed. And actually, we're also seeing a clever, subtle variation on that because screamed is a verb and screams is noun. What's that called when you shift from one part of speech to another part of the speech within the same word family? This is Polyptoton. Do you remember that, everyone? Polyptoton? It's a form of repetition where you use a word in one form and then shift it into another, in this case from verb to noun. Keep in mind, by the way, that the sibilant alliteration is still at work there. Someone screamed, type animal screams of fear and pain. By the way, scream and fear, but very much the same vowel sound going on in the middle of these words with the assonance. And he didn't know that it was his sound, that he roared against the water that took him and the plane still deeper down into the water. You know, unconsciously, Byron is screaming and only suddenly becoming aware of the fact that the sound he's hearing is his own voice. Again, I find that a realistic touch. You're so dramatically engulfed by the horror of the experience that you are, in a sense, becoming detached from what your own body is doing. It's often said, for example, that when a terrible trauma is inflicted upon the body, you don't feel it immediately. He saw nothing but sensed blue, cold, blue-green, and he raked at the seatbelt catch, tore his nails loose on one hand. He ripped at it until it released, and somehow, the water trying to kill him, to end him, somehow he pulled himself out of the shattered front window and clawed up into the blue, felt something hold him back, felt his windbreaker tear, and he was free, tearing free, ripping free. Now, we're obviously seeing more of the same techniques working for different particular purposes. For example, have a look at the third last sentence of that paragraph. The noteworthy feature of it is what? What's the most obvious feature about the third last sentence of that paragraph? It begins with the words, well, tell me, which words begin the third last sentence of that paragraph? Tell me, somebody. Third last sentence. Find it. It's just a simple matter of counting back. Come on. And what are the words that commence the third last sentence? Yes, Lucy.
He ripped at it.
Yes, of course. Now, having identified where it is, everyone, tell me, Oliver, what's the most obvious feature of that sentence in your mind? What about you, Nazir? What do you think is the most obvious feature of that sentence? Its length is the most obvious feature. Look how long it is. It takes us almost to the very end because the last two sentences are really just fragments, tearing free, ripping free. They're not complete grammatically. They're just simple, short, blunt fragments, aren't they? But the third last sentence is very long. Now, this sentence is deliberately long. For what reason? Anyone? Well, what you do is, to answer that question, you look at what's going on in it and what is actually going on in that particular sentence. What's the key factor of that sentence? What is going on? Well, is Brian trying to get free from his seatbelt and out of the plane and up through the water to the surface? Because otherwise, he's going to drown. inside the plane, which has hit the water and dipped into the water. So it's a moment that for Brian is the most desperate of all. He survived the crash, he's alive. But now, can he survive by getting out of his seatbelt, getting out of the plane itself and getting up through the water to the surface? So Brian is desperately trying to free himself from the plane, and it seems to be taking for him so long. Look at the way in which it works. He ripped at it, released the water trying to kill him, pulled himself out, clawed up, felt something hold her, felt his windbreak tear. All of these actions describe this desperate moment of freeing himself from the plane and getting to the surface in order to survive. So the long sentence is very effective in capturing that idea. We've seen today long sentences used for different reasons, just as we've seen shorter sentences and sentence fragments being used for different reasons as well. Sometimes it's capturing for us the moment of dramatic impact. Sometimes it's capturing the sense of time being suspended in an almost dreamlike unreality. And sometimes it's to describe a series of violent, quick actions, tearing free, ripping free, which is, by the way, again, using epistrophe, isn't it? So much going on in terms of techniques in this single chapter, because the whole chapter is devoted to one thing only, the plane crash, and does Brian survive?